The city of Milwaukee during the late 20th century was a place of industrial grit and Midwestern hospitality, a backdrop where someone unremarkable could vanish into the crowd. Among its residents was a young man named Jeffrey Dahmer, whose appearance was so average that he did not just exist, he blended into the city's brickwork like a shadow. He was the man you might see waiting for a bus or buying coffee, a figure of profound, mundane normalcy who possessed a chilling, inherent ability to deflect any form of outside scrutiny or suspicion from the neighbors. This facade was not merely a disguise, it was a psychological shield that allowed him to hide a growing internal void. Beneath the surface of his mundane life, a terrifying hunger was taking root, a darkness born long before he ever walked the streets of Milwaukee as a man. His journey began in the fractured environment of his childhood home. The cold, damp walls of his youth were often filled with the sharp, echoing sounds of his parents' constant arguments, a domestic war that left Jeffrey feeling like a ghost in his own house, wandering the halls in silence. Isolated, he turned his attention away from human connection and toward morbid, dark fascinations. He became obsessed with the remnants of the dead, finding a strange, clinical peace in animal carcasses and bleached bones. For Jeffrey, these were not just hobbies. They were early attempts to understand the permanence of form and the absolute control that comes with death. This early detachment from the living provided the foundation for a monster. The first manifestation of this internal beast occurred in the summer of 1978. It was a moment of impulsive violence that shattered the life of a young hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks on a lonely road. Jeffrey had invited him back for a few beers, a seemingly innocent gesture from a quiet man. However, when Hicks tried to leave, the fear of abandonment triggered something primal. In a desperate bid to keep his companion, he struck Hicks down. The aftermath was a blur of panic and crushing weight as the reality of his actions settled into his bones. He spent hours meticulously disposing of the evidence, grinding bones into dust and scattering them into the woods, a process that cemented his commitment to his internal darkness. For the next decade, Jeffrey lived in agonizing suppression. He joined the army and was stationed in West Germany, hoping military life would silence the whispers. He turned to alcohol to numb his compulsions, drowning his urges in cheap liquor while maintaining the image of a soldier. He eventually moved into the safety of his grandmother's house in West Allis, a residence that became the sanctuary for his resurfacing beast. Living in the basement, he existed in a dual reality. Upstairs, he was the dutiful grandson. Downstairs, he was a predator refining his method. He learned that his harmlessness was a potent tool, using his unassuming nature to convince men they were safe. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. His method was chillingly efficient. He understood the rhythm of the city and the vulnerabilities of those in the shadows. His inner conflict was an exhausting, a relentless battle between a desire to belong and a compulsion to possess others completely. He didn't want to be with people. He wanted to own them, to stop their movement so they could never leave him. This struggle eventually became too large for the confines of his grandmother's basement. The pressure of his crimes demanded a new stage, a place where he could descend into his horrors without the prying eyes of family. This led him to the Oxford Apartments, a nondescript building that would soon be transformed into a literal house of nightmares. As he moved his few belongings into apartment 213, the quiet man from Milwaukee prepared to enter a final, blood-soaked and terrifying chapter where his facade of normalcy would finally, inevitably, begin to rot and crumble away into the dark, painful history of the city of Milwaukee forever. The apartment 213 was no longer just a dwelling. It had evolved into a meticulously organized laboratory for his darkest impulses. The small space within the Oxford Apartments became a sanctuary where the pretense of a normal life finally dissolved into a clinical obsession with the preservation of human remains. The living room, once a place of rest, was now cluttered with the tools of his trade, and the refrigerator held secrets far more macabre than any ordinary food. Inside those walls, the air was stagnant and heavy, dominated by the looming presence of a large blue industrial vat. By the early 1990s, the internal beast that had once been a whispering urge had become a deafening roar that could no longer be ignored. Jeffrey's hunting grew increasingly frequent, or a frantic spree driven by an insatiable need for a companionship that the living, with their independent wills and voices, simply could not provide. He patrolled the streets of Milwaukee with a calculated, predatory grace, using his unassuming appearance to lure unsuspecting men back to this theater of death where he could finally exercise the absolute control he craved. The physical reality of his crimes soon began to seep through the floorboards and under the doorframe, permeating the shared spaces of the entire building. The air in the hallways grew heavy with a cloying, sickly scent of rot that no amount of industrial incense or cleaning supplies could ever hope to mask. Neighbors frequently complained about the persistent stench and the mechanical buzzing of large flies that seemed to congregate around his unit like a dark cloud. Yet, Jeffrey was always prepared with a mundane explanation. He spoke of a malfunctioning freezer or spoiled meat, his excuses acting as a psychological sedative for those who dared to question him. This tragic oversight reached its most harrowing peak during the incident involving 14-year-old Konarak Synthesomphone. The young boy, dazed and bleeding, had managed to escape the apartment and stumble onto the street. When concerned neighbors called the police, Jeffrey's calm facade proved more convincing than the visible trauma of the child. He convinced the responding officers that Konarak was his adult lover, and they were having a simple argument. In a failure of the law that continues to haunt the city, the officers escorted the boy back into the apartment, effectively delivering him back to his executioner. Emboldened by this escape from justice, Jeffrey's methods descended into a new level of depravity as he developed a terrifying God complex. He began performing surgical experiments on his victims, injecting acid or boiling water into their brains in a desperate attempt to create zombies, individuals who would be physically alive but stripped of their will, remaining with him forever as silent companions. These horrific acts were fueled by his own rapid psychological decay. As the body count grew, Jeffrey's reliance on alcohol became absolute. He needed the numbing effect of gin to silence the flickering remnants of his own conscience and the sensory overload of his environment. He lost his job at the chocolate factory, his life narrowing down to the four walls of his apartment and the increasingly chaotic pile of human remains he could no longer manage. He was drowning in his own atrocities, existing in a state of perpetual intoxication while the world outside remained unaware of the charnel house in their midst. The cycle of blood finally neared its end on the night of July 22, 1991, during an encounter with Tracy Edwards. Jeffrey had lured him back with empty promises of money and beer, but Tracy immediately sensed the oppressive atmosphere of the apartment. The stench was undeniable, and the feeling of being hunted was palpable. When Jeffrey produced a knife and handcuffs, trying to force him into submission, Tracy's survival instinct took over. He waited for a moment of distraction, struck Jeffrey with a desperate blow, and then bolted out the door into the night air. He flagged down a patrol car, his terror so raw and visible that the officers could not ignore it. They followed Tracy back to apartment 213, initially intending only to investigate a disturbance. However, as they entered the room, one officer noticed the overwhelming smell and the clutter of the space. He approached a bedside drawer and pulled it open, expecting to find drugs or a weapon. Instead, his flashlight illuminated a collection of Polaroids that shattered the illusion of the quiet neighbor forever, revealing the true face of the monster who had been hiding in plain sight. The flashing lights of patrol cars illuminated the street outside the Oxford apartments as the reality of Tracy Edwards' escape began to dismantle a decade of horror. As the world watched, No siren could drown out the collective gasp of a society suddenly confronted with the unimaginable. Investigators in biohazard suits carried out the remains of 17 lives, and the scale of the atrocities leaked into the press with terrifying speed. The quiet man from apartment 213 was no longer just a neighbor. He was a global spectacle of depravity. Milwaukee was now synonymous with the charnel house he created. People watched their screens in stunned silence as details of the vats and skulls emerged, painting a picture of a predator who had moved among them like a ghost, hidden by a mask of mundanity. When the trial commenced, the courtroom became a theater of profound grief. Jeffrey sat behind a plexiglass barrier, his expression hauntingly vacant, a contrast to the raw agony of the victims' families. The testimony of sisters, the brothers and parents filled the room with a suffocating sadness as they spoke of the vibrant lives he had extinguished. Throughout the proceedings, Dahmer spoke with clinical detachment. Instead, he explained his crimes with monotone precision. He claimed he felt no animosity toward his victims. He killed them because he liked them and didn't want them to leave. He sought a companionship that bypassed human will, preferring a silent, static presence to the complexity of the living. This terrifying need for control was the final evolution of the beast, a compulsion to possess the human form entirely. Despite attempts to paint him as legally insane, the jury found he was fully capable of understanding his actions. The verdict was a crushing weight of justice, 15 consecutive life terms, followed by a 16th for the murder of Stephen Hicks. He was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution, where the monster of Milwaukee traded his apartment laboratory for a concrete cell, becoming just another number in a cold system built to contain the dangerous and the discarded. Prison life brought a strange transformation as Jeffrey turned toward religion, seeking a baptism that some viewed as redemption and others as a manipulative act. Regardless, he remained one of the most hated men on the planet. He walked the halls with a target on his back, a reminder of the failures of the law and the fragility of human safety. That tension snapped on November 28, 1994. While cleaning the prison gym, he was confronted by Christopher Scarver, an inmate who believed he was acting on a divine mission. And Scarver used a heavy metal bar to deliver the final blows, ending the life of the man who had stolen so many others. The beast was silenced in a brutal corner of a prison, bringing a violent end to a life defined by violence. Yet, his death did not bring immediate closure. The legacy of his crimes left permanent scars on Milwaukee's psyche. It forced a painful reckoning within the police department regarding the systemic biases that allowed him to operate. The families of the 17 victims were left to navigate a world forever changed, their grief a living testament to those lost. The Oxford apartments were demolished, erasing the physical space, but the memory remains a somber warning of how the normal can hide the horrific. Ultimately, the story of Jeffrey Dahmer serves as a grim reflection on the nature of evil. Not as a supernatural force, but as a series of choices made by a man who prioritized his own dark desires over the sanctity of human life. It is a tragedy born from isolation and the capacity of the mind to justify the unjustifiable. As the dust settled, all that remained were the names of those he took, lives remembered for the light they carried before the shadow of the monster fell across their paths. Their stories are the only ones that matter now, standing as a final defiance against the man who tried to own them.